And then Caitlin, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Just get that out of the way. Yes, I'm Caitlin, and I'm a dietitian, diabetes educator here at Community Wellness. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how to be an informed health information consumer. And I think this is a really important topic for a lot of reasons that we'll get into. So these days we are inundated with health information, and it can be just really hard to navigate all the information that's available on any given topic, especially since more often than not, there is a lot of conflicting information everywhere you turn. This is especially true when it comes to nutrition. A lot of times there are two sources that say completely opposing things, but with equal amounts of certainty. So what do you make of that? In my job, I spend a lot of time trying to help people navigate all the information and the misinformation that they encounter. So my goal today is to share with you some background about why we found ourselves in this mess and my best strategies for sifting through the nonsense and getting closer to the truth. My hope is that today you are going to walk away feeling more empowered to make health and nutrition related choices based on information that you read, listen to, or watch. So let's get started. Today, we are going to start out talking about the problem and why it is so tricky to deal with, finding reliable health and nutrition information. We're going to talk about some different types of health misinformation and where you might encounter it, some red flags that you might learn to spot, and how to build your detective skills to be able to interpret health information or, find good sources. And then I'll share some of my favorite reliable sources. So the problem, why is health information so tricky? To get started with this question, I am going to share a study. So this study I like to call the chocolate study. And it was done several years back. It included 16 people and it lasted for 3 weeks. It compared a standard low-carb diet, a low-carb diet plus dark chocolate, and an unchanged control diet. The chocolate group, the study found, lost 1 to 2 pounds more than the standard low-carb group. How exciting. The people who ate the chocolate lost the most weight. This study tracked 18 different variables, but they didn't track what the participants ate. The study then ended up getting published in a for-profit journal. So this all sounds great. If you eat more chocolate, you'll lose more weight. Who doesn't want to hear that? Well, the only problem here is that the study was actually a hoax. It was created by a guy named John Bohannon, and he intentionally designed the study to be problematic because he wanted to expose issues with how nutrition research is conducted and reported on in the world today. So he created this really flawed, problematic study, and we are going to talk more later about why it is problematic. But even though it had so many problems, it ended up getting picked up by a lot of major news outlets throughout the world. And John Bohannon, talks about how surprised he was at how little vetting a lot of these news outlets did when they were, talking to him about the study. And a lot of really exciting headlines came out about this study, things like those who eat chocolate stay slim, and dieting, don't forget the chocolate. So these are real headlines that came from this study. So we are going to put a pin in this chocolate study and come back to it later on after we've talked more about health misinformation, and we'll explore why it was done and what we might be able to learn from it. Let's take a minute and talk about the types of false or misleading health information. Misleading health information can come in many different shapes and sizes. Here's a few key terms that can help us understand it. So misinformation just means the spread of false information. This may or may not be intentional. People might not realize that the information that they're spreading is not accurate. Disinformation implies an intent. So people realize that they are spreading information that's not true, and they're doing it for oftentimes political or financial gains. And then there's this term, infodemic. And the World Health Organization defines an infodemic as an overabundance of information. Some of it may be accurate and some of it is not. And this overabundance, or just the sheer volume of information, makes it really hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. And the term infodemic has been used a lot to describe the pandemic, the state of health information during that time. I personally feel that we have been in kind of a nutrition infodemic for quite a long time. There is a lot of information, and it's so confusing to know what is accurate and what is not. Why is health misinformation so prevalent? I have a few thoughts. So let's go through the reasons. One is the rise of social media, YouTube, podcasts, and blogs. All of these platforms use models that are built on virality, so things going viral, where sensational content spreads much faster than accurate or nuanced content. It doesn't really matter how accurate something is for it to go viral. A lot of times there are financial incentives involved. So maybe people are selling something, or a lot of times it's just that our economy relies a lot on clicks, views, shares, subscriptions, ad revenue. And this type of model can incentivize just putting stuff out there that's going to go viral or get a lot of clicks or views. And so it can lead to the spread of ideas regardless of the quality. There's a little bit of skepticism of institutions these days. I think this started to increase during the pandemic. It's more common these days for people to say, well, I don't trust these government health organizations. I don't trust my doctor anymore. I have this, YouTube personality or blogger or podcaster who is more in line with my values, and I'm going to go to them for information, including health information. Concern for their health makes people particularly vulnerable. And as an example, we saw health information really increase a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a time when, I'm sure you all can remember, we were all feeling really scared about our health, and that made us more vulnerable. And the same can be true for people who get diagnosed with a health condition or an illness, or maybe they're concerned about their weight. This makes them more vulnerable as they search for solutions to information that may or may not be true. A lot of health topics have become heavily politicized. And when this happens, it's really common for people on either side to spread information that just advances their agenda, whether it's true or not. Examples of topics that are politicized are vaccines, weight, LGBTQ health, where we see all sorts of information being put out about these topics from either side of the issue, whether it's accurate or not. And this is a phenomenon that I think is really interesting, but there seems to be a religious adherence to health philosophies sometimes. And when this happens, people become so attached to ideologies around health and nutrition that they are not really willing to entertain the possibility that there, might be something else that's more true, or to question their beliefs. And in some cases, they'll go to great lengths to find or create supporting evidence. And I read a really interesting quote from an article in the Seattle Times when I was putting this presentation together. So I'll share it with you. It said, just as there are differing religious ideologies, there are differing dietary ideologies. And in our increasingly secular society, so meaning fewer people are identifying with kind of traditional religions, our dietary beliefs can become as dogmatic as those of any religion. So you might see somebody who really, really strictly adheres to only natural remedies and can have like a very religious adherence to that idea, or a vegan diet, or whatever it might be. So that's one of the phenomenon that I see. And At the end of the day, it's my belief that a lot of misinformation comes from just folks who are well-intentioned but mistaken, or maybe got bad information themselves, including many health professionals. I'm sure I know for a fact I have perpetuated things that, I hadn't vetted well enough and weren't necessarily true. I try to do better, but, a lot of times it is that misinformation rather than disinformation where it's not intentional. And health misinformation spreading, it does matter because there are impacts for people. There can be financial losses, people spending money on things that, maybe aren't going to work, or there really isn't evidence to support. There are suboptimal health practices where people are taking on habits or trying out regimens that don't have any, evidence that they're going to work. Sometimes people end up adhering to really unnecessarily rigid diets or health regimens. This is pretty common. A lot of the things that I see going viral tend to be pretty extreme or rigid. For whatever reason, people are drawn to that. As an example, I've been hearing more and more about the carnivore diet, and people telling me, well, I was watching YouTube and I got this, suggested video about the carnivore diet, which is a diet where all you eat is meat. You don't eat anything else. It gave me a bunch of other videos, and now I'm following this diet. And it's a very rigid, and there's not a lot of evidence to support it. So it can also lead to confusion and loss of confidence. When you have sort of this infodemic state of information, and there's just so much information, I've seen people get kind of paralyzed. It can lead to fear, stress, and other negative emotions. I'm thinking of a particular patient who came in to see me, and she told me she had recently been diagnosed with diabetes. And she told me she'd been on the internet, she'd been trying to do some research about what to eat, and she was so confused that she was basically hardly eating at all because she felt like everything might be bad for her. She was really worried about her blood sugars, and she was just scared to eat. And this is kind of a great example of how all of this excessive information that you don't know how to navigate can just be paralyzing. And just really quickly, I want to touch on another factor that we're dealing with. There are just some inherent problems with research, and particularly nutrition research. A lot of times there can be what we call publication bias, a bias towards publishing studies that get the desired outcome and that show the type of results that people want to hear. Studies that don't show, like a study that shows, oh, chocolate doesn't help you lose weight, is less likely to get published than a study that shows that it does, because those are more exciting results to us. There's a lot of industry funding that happens, and that can create conflicts of interests. There are those for-profit or other poor quality journals. I mentioned that the chocolate study got published in a for-profit journal. Well, the problem with this is that they don't have as rigid of peer review processes. They are more likely to publish lower quality research, but a lot of times, the public can't really differentiate very well between what has and what hasn't been peer reviewed. We rely on the journals to do that for us, and that's maybe not happening as much. And then there are just some challenges with conducting good nutrition research. It's hard to isolate just one variable because we all eat a lot of different foods. We have a lot of different habits with our health. It's hard to know, is one type of food or one variable really what's leading to the outcome. A lot of times nutrition research relies on self-reporting, people just filling out questionnaires about what they eat or giving recalls of what they have eaten. And then ideally, research will be, blinded and randomized controlled trials. And it's just kind of hard to do that in nutrition research for practical reasons. So even in the best case scenario, it's just hard to do really good nutrition research. That doesn't mean there aren't people who are doing it, but it's a little bit harder. Okay, so now that we've talked about the problem, we're going to move on and talk about some different types of health information or health and nutrition media, and how you might encounter some of these less than reliable health and nutrition, pieces of information. So I'm going to go through some various different types of media and talk about some challenges and some strategies for each. I want to start with nutrition books. There's lots and lots of nutrition books out there. Many of them are bestsellers. The problem is that a lot of times they really contradict each other. So here is an example. These are 3 nutrition books, all of which were bestsellers, and they were written by physicians, and they come to 3 completely opposing conclusions. Here we have Grain Brain. This one, the subtitle says it all. The surprising truth about wheat, carbs, and sugar, your brain's silent killers. So some pretty fantastic language. The bias in this book is gluten-free. The whole thesis of the book is that gluten is really bad for everybody's health. Then we have How Not to Die. Discover the foods scientifically proven to prevent and reverse disease. Also sounds great. This one really promotes a vegan diet. And then the Obesity Code, Unlocking the Secret for Weight Loss. This one ends up being all about a low-carb diet with intermittent fasting. So what are we to make of this situation? And I will say, I actually did encounter a patient whose doctor had recommended 3 nutrition books that were similarly all opposing. And this poor person was royally confused. So what do we make of this? Well, all these books represent different interpretations of nutrition research that have led to more extreme conclusions, but none of them are actually representing the totality of the body of nutrition research. They're just cherry-picking studies to fit into their views. They all contain good information and plans that may work really well for some people, but in my opinion, they misrepresent and oversimplify the science of healthy eating. It's not true that if we just stop eating gluten or go vegan or do, intermittent fasting, it'll solve all of our health problems, and that won't necessarily be the best solution for everybody. And so, just for fun, just in case anybody is ever interested in writing a best-selling nutrition book, I feel like I have discovered the formula for how to do it. So I'm going to share that with you now. So in part 1, you need to describe why everything you thought you knew about health and nutrition is wrong and has been slowly killing you. In part 2, you present a thesis as the only alternative to regaining your health with a bunch of supporting evidence and usually no conflicting evidence, even though there might be a lot that does exist. And in part 3, you provide a plan that you absolutely must follow, and usually there's some great anecdotes about people who've been transformed by the plan. So not all books use this formula, but this is the one that I've seen in the nutrition books that I've read, and it does a really good job of selling books, but it really lacks the nuance that I think is needed to really responsibly talk about health and nutrition. So there you go. If you want to make a best-selling nutrition book, now you know how. Nutrition documentaries are another popular way that sort of the general public hears about nutrition information. The problem is a lot of times they are often really biased as well. Here are 2 documentaries that were on Netflix a number of years back, maybe 5 years ago or so. And I watched them in pretty short succession. And I remember being struck by how similar they were in terms of like how they were done and how they came to completely opposite conclusions from each other. So the first one is What the Health? And this one was a really hardcore vegan documentary. And it had a lot of information, and a lot of it I found to be pretty questionable. Here's an example. It says eating 1 egg per day is just as bad as smoking 5 cigarettes per day for your life expectancy. Well, there's not really a lot of research that would say something that extreme, but there you have it. And then the magic pill, this one was similarly sort of intense about promoting a low carb keto style diet. And so there's also a formula for nutrition documentaries in case you're interested in making one. So I'm going to share it now. Part 1, we got to introduce the problem, usually starting with one or more characters with poor health, shown with low color saturation and very ominous music. And the picture on the top here is from What the Health, and we have a very sort of washed out, low color scene here where a mother is serving her children cigarettes for breakfast from a frying pan, presumably because cigarettes are analogous to eggs. So that's part 1. In part 2, we get the supporting evidence, and it's usually given in the form of sound bites from doctors or other experts, snippets taken from studies. A lot of times there's no citations, and we get lots of anecdotes from people who are following this plan. And then in part 3, we revisit the characters in the beginning who were, in the washed out, ominous music situation. And now they are doing the proposed diet, and we show them with, feeling great, living healthy, active lifestyles, bright, saturated colors, uplifting music. And here is a scene from The Magic Pill, where these people are, in a brightly colored room, and they're having this meal, and everybody's happy. So this is a formula that is very compelling. It's designed to actually manipulate us, though, and it manipulates us into buying into whatever their narrative is. And just like the books, it's not giving you a complete and well-rounded picture of what we know about healthy eating and healthy living. It's just giving you sort of one version of what that could look like. So that's nutrition documentaries. Now let's move on to blogs and podcasts. I personally am a huge podcast listener. I listen to tons of them. I do read some blogs as well. I think they can be a great way to get engaging and useful content, and you can hear from lots of diverse voices. So not speaking bad about blogs and podcasts, but there are some challenges. You want to be aware that they're usually highlighting a single person's viewpoint and their interpretation of the evidence. So reading or listening to just a high volume of one person's views can have the effect of making you feel like it's representative. But it's actually just that one person's view. Writers and speakers also may or may not have a lot of education or training on the subject matter, because anybody can write a blog or a podcast. And there's no qualifications. And they can be very biased, which is not always obvious at first. So maybe there's a pretty generic sounding title like Nutrition MD or something like that. And then you listen to it for a while and you realize, oh, they're only talking about low carb diets or vegan diets or whatever it might be. So some things you might look for, or things you might want to try to find in blogs and podcasts, are transparency. Things that are clearly stating where their information comes from, sharing supporting resources, and disclosing any sources of revenue so that you're aware of when they might be trying to sell something or where bias might be coming in. Integrity. I think it's important to have honesty about the limits of current research and their own knowledge, because we all have limits to our own knowledge. And you want people who are presenting opposing views fairly, rather than sort of trashing people who have differing views from them. And it doesn't hurt to have credentials, either created or fact-checked by a credentialed healthcare professional. You're more likely to have kind of quality or accurate information. Credentials aren't everything, but they can be helpful. YouTube and social media. These are increasingly common ways for people to get their health and nutrition information. And what's great about them is they expose people to new ideas and communities and connect us to other people. Challenges are that the algorithms of these platforms are designed to maximize engagement. They do that by delivering the most absorbing content without regard to the quality. So the algorithms don't really care, how accurate the information is. There is a little bit of, progress in these platforms of removing or flagging misinformation, but there's a long way to go. The quantity of content and or the number of supporting comments can create the illusion of accuracy or consensus. So let's say you watch a video about the carnivore diet and there's like 100 comments underneath for people who say, yes, this is true. Yes, this worked for me. This is really great. That volume of people in support can make you feel like, wow, there really must be something to this. When in reality, it's not representative of the broader body of, evidence. There's usually not a lot of fact checking. Information is often based on personal experience. There are a lot of financial incentives that can get into YouTube and social media that can create bias. And the algorithms are unlikely to deliver content with opposing views. So you can get kind of a bubble effect where every time you log into YouTube or your social media, all the videos or all of the content that you get is supporting the stuff that you already believe, and it can make you feel like it must be true. And I had a patient tell me recently that he started doing the carnivore diet because he was watching videos about something totally unrelated on YouTube, and a video about the carnivore diet popped up, and he kind of went down what you may have heard called a YouTube rabbit hole, where he just watched lots and lots of videos, because once you start watching something on one topic, it'll continue to serve up more of those to keep you engaged. And he became convinced that this was the best diet for him, kind of not realizing that there's not a lot of consensus around it. It's mostly just, YouTube was serving him up all of the content on that topic that he had become engaged in. So something to be aware of with YouTube. So things to look for, kind of similar to the blogs and podcasts. Credentials can be helpful, but not necessarily. Sometimes there are people with credentials like doctors, dietitians who are spreading less than representative information. Citing credible information or other sources is always good. And I like to look for a nuanced and questioning tone, humility over certainty. So people who are saying this is absolutely the only true way to eat or be healthy, it's rarely that simple. So I like to look for folks who acknowledge the complexity of health and nutrition. And news. We sort of touched on news with the chocolate study, but news, of course, can be a really important means of disseminating health information to the public. But there are challenges with it. So these days, just like a lot of online content, the revenue is driven by clicks, views, and audience engagement. And so that selects for more sensational stories and headlines that are going to really be eye-catching rather than nuanced information. They will often report on results of a single study without mentioning how it fits into the body of existing research. It's rare to hear about limitations of the study. A lot of the news reports on the chocolate study weren't talking about, it was a small study or, potential flaws of it. They just focused on, that one result that was really exciting that people would want to hear of chocolate helps you lose weight. And it's not uncommon for news outlets to extrapolate study results into recommendations. So taking one study about chocolate and saying, well, this means that you should eat chocolate if you want to lose weight. Well, it's not really wise to take one study and make sweeping recommendations based on that study. We want to make recommendations on a lot of different studies. So what you can look for, well, it can be kind of tricky, but you can try to find news sources that seem like they're prioritizing responsible and accurate health reporting. Articles that attempt to place a single study into context and or highlight multiple viewpoints or interpretations can be good. Maybe they will take a piece of research and have multiple experts weigh in on it. That can be a good format, or just mentioning some of the limitations of the study and how it fits in with other similar studies. Subtlety and nuance rather than sweeping or absolute statements is always better, in my opinion. And I just want to say a word on artificial intelligence, because this is really an emerging source of information, and it's a technology that is really rapidly changing, and I think it's going to be more and more relevant in the coming years. Large language models like ChatGPT, you may be familiar with ChatGPT. They provide information that's synthesized from all around the internet in a conversational format. Microsoft Bing is now incorporating ChatGPT into its search engine, and I tried it the other day and I typed in, what should I eat if I have diabetes? And it gave me kind of a paragraph and some, blogs that it had pulled this information from, and you can converse with it and ask follow-up questions. So it's really interesting. And artificial intelligence, not only is it, doing this conversational type of presenting information, it's increasingly able to generate convincing information, whether or not it's true. Kind of a funny example, you may have heard in the news that an artificial intelligence came up with a collaboration song between the pop stars Drake and The Weeknd, and it sounded just like them. It was very convincing, and it was all fake. The two of them never worked together on that song. So that's just one example of the type of content that can come out, but there is a lot of health related content and nutrition related content that can be generated by AI and seem very convincing. So the implications of AI on the spread of health information, we don't know yet. We'll see, but I think they're going to be big. So just something to be aware of on the land, that's coming. Okay. So in conclusion, all hope is lost. Just kidding. So it can definitely be tricky out there, but there are some important tools and strategies that you can use to sift through all of the noise when it comes to health information. So I like to call this being a health information detective. So now that's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. Rule number one of being a health information detective is to start noticing clues, or we are going to call them red flags. So I've already touched on some of these, but just to summarize, if something is presented in health and nutrition media without any supporting evidence, it's just stated as fact, that is a red flag. Just citing one study with no mention of any weaknesses of that study or any other research that found different conclusions, red flag. Presenting information out of context and without reference to the overall body of evidence can be very misleading. That's a red flag. Only using animal studies to support claims about human health, this is very dubious because humans and animals are actually quite different. So animal studies have their place in research, but they're not good as a standalone source of research for making conclusions about human health. Relying on anecdotes or stories from individuals to support a claim. Anecdotes are great, but they don't take the place of a whole bunch of well done studies. Presenting something as the only or absolute best diet or health solution. The truth is there is no one size fits all diet or path to health for everyone. So anyone who says there is, that to me is a red flag. Making extreme or absolute statements. A lot of times things are not that simple. They're almost always more complicated. So another red flag. A vested interest in convincing you of a claim. Are they trying to make money by convincing you that something is true? That should be cause for question. Promising an easy or quick fix. there's rarely sort of quick fix or easy solutions to complex health problems. So this is a red flag. Cure-alls with a wide variety of health claims. So if it's one like type of juice or one remedy that cures diabetes and cancer and heart disease and insomnia and stress, and if the list goes on, that's usually pretty dubious. And above all, if it sounds too good to be true, well, trust your gut. Be skeptical, ask questions. So those are red flags for nutrition media. And for those of you who are nerds like me and like to read nutrition research or are interested in reading studies or even just reading articles about research studies where they present the results, here are a few red flags you might look for. And we can think about the chocolate study when we're thinking about this one, or when we're talking through this slide. So a really small sample size. It's hard to really make firm conclusions on just a few participants in a study. A really short study duration, oftentimes, longer term studies give us more meaningful information. Questionable methodology. For example, in the chocolate study, everybody self-reported all of their information. Also, they didn't even ask the people what they were actually eating. So that's confusing how they drew any conclusions from that. Retrospective studies versus randomized controlled trials or prospective cohort studies, we want to go with the latter when possible. Studies with disease markers rather than actual health outcomes as endpoints. So if a study is just focusing on, eating chocolate or not eating chocolate, helps you lower your cholesterol. Well, it's more meaningful to say, does it reduce your risk of a heart attack or a stroke, which is what we're really looking for when we talk about cholesterol. Having a certain effect on cholesterol doesn't necessarily play out in terms of reducing heart attack or stroke. If it's published in a small, obscure, and or a for-profit journal, then it may not have been peer-reviewed as rigorously, and that is questionable. And studies that are outliers. So if most of the studies show that saturated fat increases your risk of heart disease if you have more of it in your diet, and then there's one study that says, well, actually eating more saturated fat is better for your heart, we should question that because the larger body of research is showing the opposite. So a lot of times you'll hear news reporting on this, really like study that really shook everything up. And that is actually something that might make you skeptical. Conflicts of interests with funding or authors. If somebody has a vested interest in a study having a certain outcome, that could introduce bias. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's circle back to the chocolate study. So again, it included only 16 people. It lasted for 3 weeks. It was comparing a standard low-carb diet, the low-carb diet plus dark chocolate, and an unchanged control diet. And it showed that people lost 1 to 2 more pounds if they ate chocolate. It tracked a lot of different variables, but not what people were actually eating. And it was published in a for-profit journal. So I'll ask you to just think about a few questions. What are some of the red flags that you can identify in this study? And you might be thinking maybe the small sample size or the short duration, or the fact that it was just relying on people self-reporting their weight, all their information, and they didn't even ask people what they actually ate. Or maybe the fact that it was published in a for-profit journal. It probably wasn't thoroughly peer-reviewed. So those are some red flags. And what about in the way that it was reported? Well, you might be thinking about the fact that it wasn't very thoroughly vetted. And ask yourself why you think it caught on so much. Why might people have been really excited to spread the word about a study that showed that chocolate makes you lose weight? Well, a lot of people want to lose weight and a lot of people like chocolate. So who wouldn't want to hear those results? And how might the media have portrayed these results a little bit more responsibly? Maybe they could have done a little more vetting. Maybe they could have shared, more information about chocolate-related research or weight and obesity-related research. There's a lot of things that they could have done to be more responsible. All right, so now I want to offer some tools for finding reliable health information, tools and strategies. And first, just a note on consensus. I personally believe that oftentimes 2 or 3 or more heads are better than one when it comes to making recommendations based on health and nutrition related research. No information source is perfect. There's always potential for bias and human error and difference of opinion. Organizations that evaluate all available research are more likely to provide truly evidence-based information and recommendations. And so I like to go for consensus rather than just 1 or 2 people's opinions. Here are my pro tips for being an informed consumer. Number 1, it's not a bad idea to have a few trusted sources that you go to first. I'll share some of my favorites in just a moment. Seek advice from credentialed health professionals like physicians or registered dietitians. A lot of times we have more training in interpreting health information and can help you do that. Get a second opinion. Look for other sources that might have opposing views or point out flaws in a health-related article or movie or claim. If you find yourself in sort of an information bubble where you're getting a lot of information that confirms your views, maybe step outside that and see what it's like to look at some opposing views about health and nutrition. Dig deeper. Rather than taking health claims at face value, especially before you act on them, do a little more research. Maybe ask your doctor, ask a dietitian, look at some different sources of information and see if they're valid. Think about how one study or piece of information fits into the broader context. It's all about context. And trust your gut. If something doesn't sound right for you, it probably is wise to question it. Here are some of my favorite sources of health information. Like I said, I like to go for consensus, and a lot of these organizations are not just relying on a single person's viewpoints. They are having groups of experts that evaluate a lot of the existing evidence and putting out consumer information based on it. So the CDC, NIH, American Diabetes, Heart and Cancer Societies, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic have pretty good health blogs and online information. Harvard University, I also really like their blogs. And sometimes health blogs that are fact-checked or evaluated by healthcare professionals can be decent. I know like Prevention and Healthline and WebMD and stuff, they at least have like, this article was reviewed by a doctor. And so that's a little bit better than just, a random blog. And if you want to read research, going for high quality journals, some examples are Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, British Medical Journal, Nature, and there are others, but there's just a few examples. And I'll close with just some of my opinions. And if you've learned anything from today, you will take everything that I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But here are my thoughts on what the current body of nutrition research says, based on what I've read and learned in my years of practice. So number 1, vegetables. Yes, they really are that good for you. It's probably a good idea to eat more healthy, more whole plant foods. It's probably a good idea to eat a little bit less red and processed meat. You may want to limit highly processed foods, but you can relax. There's no food in the food supply that will kill you in moderation. No matter what anyone tells you, there's just no evidence to say that is true. And there actually are government agencies making sure we don't have super dangerous stuff in our food supply. You might want to get your vitamins and minerals from food rather than supplements. They tend to be more effective that way. And you want to find what works for you. It turns out that humans can and do thrive on a variety of different eating patterns. And you will find a lot of information that says that, this, that, or the other diet is the best one, but that just doesn't bear out in the research. And keep in mind, it is a marathon and not a sprint. So I encourage everybody to focus on creating sustainable, healthy eating habits, because that tends to work better than dieting or anything short term. So those are just my thoughts. All right. So in conclusion, we have made tremendous strides across human history with our knowledge about health, but there is still so much that we don't know. To me, the most responsible sources of health information are honest about what we know, what we don't know, and what we're just guessing at. Your best bet is to approach learning about your health with an open and questioning mind and a healthy dose of humility. And that is what I always strive to do. And here are some sources that I got my information from. So I want to open it up to some questions.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was great. We don't have any questions so far, but if you guys do have any questions, feel free to put them in the question and answer box or the chat, and we will read those out to Caitlin to answer. So I'm going to give it a minute or two to see if any questions come in before we end for today. All right, still don't see any questions coming in. So I think we will conclude today's presentation. If you do have any questions, feel free, if you think of them later, feel free to email us at wellness.wa@providence.org, and we can get you a response back. So with that, thank you, Caitlin, for presenting today. Thank you all for being here, and we'll hope to see you at the next presentation.